The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient elm trees surrounding St. Bartholomew's Church Hall, where the annual Meadowbrook Village Summer Exhibition was reaching its genteel crescendo. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a woman of 73 whose keen blue eyes missed nothing despite her unassuming demeanor, sat quietly on a wooden chair near the refreshment table, her knitting needles clicking in a steady, meditative rhythm. To the casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in the pale lavender shawl taking shape in her lap. But those who knew her well understood that Miss Hartwell's attention was rarely confined to a single pursuit. The exhibition hall buzzed with the familiar energy of village social life. Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife, presided over the cake stall with military precision, while Colonel Bradshaw held forth near the prize-winning dahlias about the declining standards of modern gardening. The centerpiece of this year's exhibition, however, was the photography display organized by Mr. Sebastian Vale, a distinguished portrait photographer who had recently taken residence in Ivy Cottage on the village outskirts. Mr. Vale was a man who commanded attention without seeming to seek it. Tall and silver-haired, with the sort of weathered handsomeness that spoke of interesting experiences, he moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his expensive camera equipment arranged on a cloth-covered table like instruments of precision. He had volunteered to judge the amateur photography competition and, as a special treat, to demonstrate the art of portrait photography using his professional apparatus. Miss Hartwell observed the subtle currents of interaction flowing around the photographer. Mrs. Vivian Ashford, the recently widowed owner of Rosemere House, seemed particularly attentive to Mr. Vale's explanations of lighting and composition. She was an elegant woman in her early 40s, with prematurely silver hair that she wore in a sophisticated chignon. And there was something in the way she listened to him, a quality of focused attention that suggested more than casual interest in photography. Dr. Marcus Fleming, the village's bachelor physician, stood somewhat apart from the group, his jaw set in lines of barely concealed irritation. Miss Hartwell noted how his gaze frequently shifted between Mrs. Ashford and the photographer, and how his hands remained clenched behind his back, even as he maintained polite conversation with the vicar about the upcoming church fete. Young Timothy Ashford, Mrs. Ashford's stepson from her late husband's first marriage, hovered nervously near the photography equipment. The boy, barely 22, had the anxious demeanor of someone carrying burdens beyond his years. His hands trembled slightly as he helped arrange the chairs for the portrait demonstration, and Miss Hartwell observed how his eyes kept darting toward the hall's side entrance as if expecting some unwelcome arrival. Also present was Miss Daphne Lytton, a pretty young woman whose engagement to Timothy had been announced only the previous month. She wore a dress the color of spring daffodils and maintained a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Miss Hartwell noticed how Daphne's attention seemed divided between her fiancé and the photographer, and how she unconsciously twisted the modest engagement ring on her finger whenever Mr. Vale spoke. As the afternoon progressed toward the promised demonstration, Mr. Vale began arranging his subjects for what he announced would be a proper group portrait using professional techniques. The large format camera, mounted on an impressive wooden tripod, dominated one end of the hall. Black cloth draped over the apparatus gave it an almost ceremonial appearance, while bottles of developing chemicals and photographic plates were arranged with scientific precision on a nearby table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Vale called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the hall, "if you would gather for our demonstration, I shall show you how a true portrait captures not merely appearance, but character itself." He gestured toward the arranged chairs with theatrical flourish. "Mrs. Ashford, if you would take the center position, Dr. Fleming perhaps to her right. Timothy, my boy, beside your stepmother." Miss Hartwell positioned herself at the edge of the group, her knitting temporarily set aside. From this vantage point, she could observe not only the photographer at work, but also the reactions of those around him. There was an undercurrent of tension in the room that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of polite conversation and forced smiles. As Mr. Vale ducked beneath the black cloth to focus his lens, his muffled voice continued directing the arrangement. "Perfect positioning, everyone. Now hold absolutely still. This exposure will require several seconds of complete immobility." The magnesium flash powder ignited with a brilliant burst of white light and acrid smoke, temporarily blinding everyone in the hall. In that moment of confusion, as eyes watered and spots danced before their vision, a sharp crack echoed through the space. Not the expected sound of photographic equipment, but something far more sinister. As the smoke cleared and vision returned, horrified gasps arose from the assembled villagers. Mr. Sebastian Vale lay crumpled behind his camera, a dark stain spreading across his pristine white shirt. The instrument of his art had become witness to his death, its lens now pointing toward the ceiling like an accusing eye. In the stunned silence that followed, Miss Hartwell's experienced gaze took in every detail: the overturned bottle of developing chemicals, their acrid smell mingling with the lingering magnesium smoke. The scattered photographic plates, some cracked and others lying pristine beside the tragedy. And most significantly, the way certain members of the group seemed less shocked than others by this devastating turn of events. Mrs. Ashford stood frozen, one hand pressed to her throat, her face pale as parchment. Dr. Fleming had already moved toward the body with professional instinct, though his expression suggested he knew his medical skills would be of no use. Timothy Ashford swayed as if he might faint, while Daphne gripped his arm with white-knuckled intensity. Miss Hartwell rose quietly from her chair, her movements deliberate and unobtrusive. As others rushed toward the tragedy or stood paralyzed by shock, she noticed several small but significant details. A faint scuff mark on the polished floor near the camera tripod, as if someone had moved quickly and carelessly. A slight disarray in the chemical bottles that suggested hasty rearrangement. And most intriguingly, the way the black focusing cloth had been pulled askew, revealing what appeared to be a small puncture in the camera's bellows. The photographer's final exposure had captured more than just a village gathering. It had frozen in time the moment when carefully buried secrets would demand their terrible reckoning, and Miss Eleanor Hartwell found herself once again drawn into the darker currents that flowed beneath the placid surface of English country life. As Dr. Fleming confirmed what everyone already knew, that Mr. Vale was beyond help, and someone hurried to telephone for the police, Miss Hartwell retrieved her knitting and settled back into her chair. Her needles resumed their gentle clicking, a sound of normalcy in the chaos, while her sharp mind began the delicate work of unraveling the threads of deception that had led to this moment. The summer exhibition at Meadowbrook had become something far more sinister than anyone had anticipated, and Miss Hartwell suspected that before this matter was resolved, more than one carefully guarded secret would be exposed to the unforgiving light of truth. Author's note: this opening section establishes our mystery while avoiding copyright issues by creating original characters inspired by Christie's style. The story combines the sophisticated atmosphere and subtle clue placement reminiscent of classic British mysteries with a fresh cast of suspects, each harboring potential motives for murder. The photography theme provides both the method and metaphor for the investigation to come, while Miss Hartwell serves as our observant detective, noting the small details that others miss in their shock and grief. Within 20 minutes, the distinctive sound of a bicycle bell announced the arrival of Constable Reeves, whose usually placid demeanor had been replaced by an urgency that spoke to the gravity of the situation. He dismounted with practiced efficiency and, after a brief word with the vicar, stepped into the hall where death had so unexpectedly visited their peaceful community. His first act was to request, in tones both apologetic and firm, that everyone remain exactly where they were until he could take their statements. The hall, which had so recently hummed with the genteel bustle of village life, settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the steady tick of the church clock in the low murmur of whispered speculation. Mrs. Pemberton, her cheeks still flushed from the day's exertions, had instinctively taken charge of the tea service, brewing endless pots as if the familiar ritual might somehow restore order to their disrupted world. Her voice carried clearly as she addressed anyone within earshot, declaring with characteristic certainty that the tragedy must have been caused by those dangerous chemicals Mr. Vale had brought into their parish hall. Colonel Bradshaw, however, would have none of such domestic explanations. His military bearing stiff with indignation, he announced to the assembled company that he knew the sound of firearms when he heard them, having served Her Majesty in more dangerous places than most could imagine. The sharp crack they had all heard was unmistakably that of a pistol, he insisted, probably some foreign contraption designed to be concealed among the photographer's equipment. Germans, he added with grim authority, were particularly clever with such mechanical deceptions. Dr. Fleming, who had knelt beside the fallen photographer and risen with the grim expression of one who could offer no hope, spoke for the first time since the tragedy. His voice carried the clinical precision of medical training as he confirmed what everyone already suspected, but no one wished to hear stated plainly. There was indeed a wound, he announced, though he refrained from elaborating on details that would inevitably find their way through the village, whether he provided them or not. His attention then turned to Mrs. Ashford, and Miss Hartwell noted the softening in his expression as he urged her to sit and accept the glass of water he had fetched. The widow, however, seemed transfixed not by the covered body, but by the camera itself, as if the wooden frame and its black cloth might yield explanations if only she watched with sufficient intensity. Timothy Ashford had recovered somewhat from his initial shock, though his face remained pale and his movements carried the uncertain quality of someone still struggling to comprehend what had occurred. When Constable Reeves questioned him about his activities during the demonstration, the young man's responses came in nervous bursts, punctuated by frequent glances toward his stepmother. He explained that he had been helping arrange the equipment and chairs, but his account of the precise moments before the flash seemed frustratingly vague, as if the events had blurred together in his memory or perhaps been deliberately obscured by anxiety. Miss Hartwell observed how Timothy's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and how his explanation of being asked to fetch something from the side entrance carried an undertone of confusion that seemed genuine. The case he had been sent to retrieve, he insisted, had not been where Mr. Vale indicated it should be, leaving him to wonder if the photographer had moved it or if he had simply misunderstood the instructions. This detail, seemingly insignificant to others, lodged itself firmly in Miss Hartwell's mind alongside the other small inconsistencies that were beginning to accumulate. Daphne Lytton maintained her bright demeanor with determined effort, though the strain was becoming increasingly apparent to anyone who cared to look closely. Her responses to the constable's questions carried the forced cheerfulness of someone working very hard to appear normal, and Miss Hartwell noticed how her fingers continued their unconscious manipulation of her engagement ring. When asked about her impression of Mr. Vale, Daphne described him as charming and professional, but there was something in her voice that suggested their relationship had been more complex than casual acquaintance. The way her gaze occasionally slid away when it encountered Dr. Fleming's steady regard did not escape Miss Hartwell's attention either. Mrs. Ashford gradually composed herself as the questioning continued, her initial pallor giving way to the controlled dignity that had served her well as mistress of Rosemere House. She spoke in measured tones about Mr. Vale's recent arrival in the village, describing him as a cultured gentleman who had been most helpful in organizing the photography exhibition. Yet Miss Hartwell noticed how carefully the widow chose her words, as if each sentence were being examined for hidden meanings before she allowed it to escape her lips. When she mentioned that Mr. Vale had been engaged to produce a series of photographs and had been paid for his services, there was a defensive quality to her tone that suggested the arrangement had been more complicated than she cared to admit. The village gossip, meanwhile, had begun to flow in those peculiar currents that Miss Hartwell knew so well from long observation of human nature. Mrs. Cartwright, whose guns were a fixture at every church function despite their middling quality, leaned confidentially toward anyone who would listen, whispering about how the photographer had taken portraits of ladies in what she delicately termed artistic poses. The implication hung in the air like incense, gathering weight and significance with each retelling. Mrs. Pemberton, ever the voice of propriety, attempted to quash such speculation, but Miss Hartwell could see that the seeds of scandal had already taken root in fertile imaginations. More intriguing still were the theories that emerged about Mr. Vale's recent activities in the village. Mr. Ellery, from the ironmonger's, his face flushed with the importance of possessing exclusive information, revealed that the photographer had spoken confidentially about finding something remarkable among his collection of old glass plates. According to Ellery, Mr. Vale had planned to reveal this discovery that very evening after tea. Something connected to Rosemere House and what he had tantalizingly described as an old family scandal. The photographer had been deliberately mysterious about the details, but his manner had suggested that whatever he had discovered would cause quite a sensation in their quiet community. As the afternoon wore on and Constable Reeves completed his preliminary questioning, Miss Hartwell began to perceive the patterns that others missed in their shock and confusion. The photographer's equipment remained largely undisturbed, creating an odd shrine to his interrupted work. The large camera still pointed toward the ceiling where the flash had sent it, its lens now capped and the focusing cloth arranged with respectful care. Yet Miss Hartwell had noted the original positions of everything before the well-meaning rearrangement began, and several details continued to demand her attention. The bottles of developing chemicals, for instance, showed signs of recent handling beyond what the demonstration would have required. One bottle in particular bore fresh fingerprints on its glass surface, and its position suggested it had been moved hastily and then replaced with less than perfect precision. More curious still was the matter of the photographic plates that had been prepared for the session. While several lay broken on the floor where they had fallen during the commotion, others remained intact and properly stored. Miss Hartwell found herself wondering whether Mr. Vale had managed to capture any images before his death, and whether those plates might contain information that someone preferred to remain undeveloped. The arrival of Inspector Lennox from the County Constabulary brought a more serious tone to the proceedings. He was a lean man with careful eyes, and the manner of someone who discovered more through silence than through speech, and his presence immediately elevated the investigation beyond the capabilities of village law enforcement. After receiving Constable Reeves's report, he examined the scene with the methodical attention of a professional, paying particular interest to details that others had overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. Miss Hartwell watched as the inspector crouched beside the camera and studied it not merely for what was there, but for what was absent. His gaze lingered on the small puncture in the focusing cloth and the subtle disarrangement that spoke of hasty movement, and when he rose to survey the assembled faces, his expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. When he announced that he would begin with those who had stood nearest to the photographer during the demonstration, the atmosphere in the hall grew noticeably more tense. As the formal questioning began at a small table near the vicar's lectern, Miss Hartwell settled back into her chair and resumed her knitting. The familiar rhythm of her needles provided a comforting counterpoint to the gravity of the situation, while her sharp mind continued to catalogue the small inconsistencies and hidden tensions that had emerged throughout this extraordinary afternoon. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone had anticipated, and she suspected that, before this matter reached its conclusion, several carefully guarded secrets would be brought into the harsh light of scrutiny. The village had reacted as villages always do when confronted with the inexplicable, by seeking to press the unknown into familiar shapes of understanding. Yet beneath the surface of their theories and speculation, Miss Hartwell sensed deeper currents at work, currents that would require more than official investigation to fully comprehend. As evening approached and the first interviews began in earnest, she found herself looking forward to the challenge of unraveling what promised to be a most intriguing puzzle of human nature and hidden motivation. Inspector Lennox began with a methodical reconstruction, asking each person to return to their positions during the fatal demonstration. The exercise revealed more about human nature than geography, as Miss Hartwell observed how memories seemed to bend towards self-preservation. Mrs. Pemberton placed herself safely behind the cake stall, while Colonel Bradshaw positioned himself as protector of the village from foreign contraptions. Dr. Fleming, however, chose a spot noticeably closer to Mrs. Ashford than the inspector's calm questioning had initially suggested, and Timothy stood uncertain until Daphne guided him to a chair with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. When Lennox inquired who had been nearest the camera during the flash, a murmur of uncertain responses followed. Dr. Fleming confirmed his position in the front rank, explaining that Mr. Vale had specifically requested stillness of character. Mrs. Ashford nodded, adding with a faint blush that the photographer had a way of talking that made one feel both comfortable and scrutinized. The conflicting accounts that emerged painted a picture of considerable movement during the crucial moments, with Mrs. Cartwright distinctly recalling Timothy hovering near the side entrance, and Daphne fetching a shawl for a draught that had appeared at precisely the right moment. Mrs. Ashford's formal interview revealed layers of complexity beneath the surface of what had seemed a straightforward professional relationship. She explained that Mr. Vale had leased Ivy Cottage through her late husband's law firm, which she continued to oversee unofficially. Their initial meeting had been purely business, but the photographer had quickly demonstrated an unusual interest in local history, particularly regarding the founding families and their property acquisitions through what she delicately termed complex legal arrangements. What troubled her most, she admitted with visible reluctance, was Mr. Vale's discovery of certain photographic materials from an estate sale, glass plate negatives dating back several decades that documented events and relationships considered private matters at the time. The photographer had approached her about these discoveries with what he described as a professional obligation to preserve historical accuracy, but Mrs. Ashford's increasingly guarded responses suggested their discussions had encompassed far more than simple historical preservation. Mr. Vale had possessed photographic evidence relating to events that could potentially affect property ownership and family reputations in the village. While not engaging in blackmail, she emphasized, he had expressed strong opinions about historical truth and his responsibility as custodian of these images. Creating tensions with those who preferred certain aspects of the past remain undisturbed. Dr. Fleming's testimony provided a different perspective, describing a man troubled by moral complexities beyond simple business concerns. The photographer had spoken during their evening encounters about the weight of knowledge and the difficulty of determining when discretion served justice versus protecting the guilty from consequences. Fleming painted a picture of someone wrestling with information that could significantly impact several families, particularly concerning the welfare of younger community members who might suffer from revelations about their elders' past actions. The doctor's careful avoidance of mentioning Mrs. Ashford by name while referring to a lady of quality in a difficult position made his meaning clear to anyone listening carefully. Timothy Ashford's interview revealed the nervous energy that had been building throughout the afternoon. His account of being sent to retrieve equipment from the side entrance grew more detailed under patient questioning, revealing several troubling discrepancies. He explained that Mr. Vale had specifically requested a particular case containing additional photographic plates. But when he reached the designated location, he found only an empty wooden crate and discarded packing materials. His extended absence during the camera preparation had occurred during the crucial period before the demonstration, and his obvious anxiety about this timing suggested he understood its potential significance. More intriguingly, Timothy revealed encountering someone else moving about near the side entrance, though he had caught only a glimpse of a figure in dark clothing disappearing around the building's corner. The person's hurried movements had struck him as odd, but he had assumed it was simply another visitor seeking the conveniences. His description remained frustratingly vague, too general to identify any specific individual, yet specific enough to confirm that others had been moving about during the critical moments. Daphne Lytton's testimony provided crucial outside perspective on the relationships developing around Mr. Vale during his brief residence. With the intuitive understanding young women often possess about such matters, she had observed that the photographer's presence had created undercurrents of tension among the village's prominent residents. Her observations about Mrs. Ashford's recent behavior painted a picture of a woman under considerable stress, while her comments about Dr. Fleming revealed her awareness of his growing attachment to the widow and his concerns for her welfare. Most significantly, she admitted overhearing a conversation between Timothy and his stepmother several days earlier that seemed to center on financial difficulties and the potential consequences of certain information becoming public knowledge. As the interviews progressed, Inspector Lennox made a discovery that transformed the investigation's direction entirely. Among Mr. Vale's effects on the photography table, he found a square envelope addressed in vigorous masculine handwriting to V.A. Opening it with a borrowed paper knife, he revealed a brief, unsigned note that read, "Rosemere, pantry door, tonight after 8. You'll see with your own eyes. Then we'll talk terms." The single horizontal line where a signature might have appeared suggested someone had thought better of leaving any identification. The word terms hung in the air like an accusation, and Colonel Bradshaw's dark repetition of it made clear how the village would interpret such correspondence. Miss Hartwell had been conducting her own quiet investigation throughout these proceedings, her knitting needles clicking steadily while her sharp eyes catalogued details others missed in their shock and confusion. She had noted the missing photographic plate from the wooden box that now contained 7 holders, where the inventory listed 8, and the curious fact that someone had capped the camera lens with practiced efficiency in those first moments after the tragedy. The bottles of developing chemicals showed signs of recent handling beyond what the demonstration required, with fresh fingerprints on surfaces that spoke of hasty movement and replacement. The scuff mark on the polished floor near the tripod particularly intrigued her, light and recent, with a thin curl at one edge, as if made by a rubber heel pivoting under haste. Combined with the small puncture in the camera's focusing cloth, its rim slightly browned as if singed, these details suggested someone had been very close to the apparatus during the crucial moments. Miss Hartwell reflected on the reflexive neatness that would cap a lens instead of covering a body, a sort of automatic response that spoke of familiarity with photographic equipment and procedure. As evening approached and the formal statements concluded, Constable Reeves's attention had clearly focused on Timothy Ashford as the most obvious suspect. The young man's nervousness, his evasive responses about his whereabouts during the critical moments, and his unconvincing alibi painted him as an easy target for official suspicion. However, Miss Hartwell remained unconvinced that such transparent anxiety indicated guilt rather than simply the overwhelming nature of finding oneself suspected of murder. Inspector Lennox announced that Timothy would accompany him for additional questioning, a development that prompted Daphne's immediate offer to provide support. The inspector's polite but firm response that Constable Reeves would ensure the young man was not alone carried the weight of official procedure over personal comfort. As Timothy departed under police escort, his pale composure and Daphne's fluttering solicitations created a tableau that seemed to confirm the direction of official thinking. Mrs. Ashford remained seated longer than the others, her gaze fixed not on the sheet-covered figure, but on the plate box the vicar was now securing in the vestry cupboard. It was an odd choice of focus for a grieving woman, and one that did not escape Miss Hartwell's notice. When she finally rose to address Inspector Lennox, her offer to produce anything required at Rosemere House carried an undertone of resignation that suggested she understood the evening's developments would inevitably lead to her door. As the hall emptied and the investigation moved toward its next phase, Miss Hartwell gathered her belongings with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent a productive afternoon observing human nature in extremis. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone anticipated, freezing in time not just faces and poses, but the moment when carefully buried secrets would demand their terrible reckoning. The anonymous note's promise of revelation at Rosemare's pantry door suggested that Mr. Vale's death had been merely the opening act in a drama that would expose the hidden foundations upon which their peaceful village had been built. Walking slowly through the churchyard as evening settled over Meadowbrook, Miss Hartwell reflected on the curious mathematics of murder. 7 plates where there had been 8, a lens cap precisely placed where it had been carelessly set aside, and the sort of domestic efficiency that appeared even in moments of supreme crisis. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and deeper questioning, but tonight she was content to let her needles click in their familiar rhythm while her mind worked through the increasingly complex pattern of deception that had led to this moment of violence in their quiet corner of England. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Inspector Lennox made the decision that would prove pivotal to unraveling the photographer's death. The anonymous note found among Mr. Vale's effects, with its cryptic reference to Rosemere pantry door tonight after 8, demanded immediate attention despite the day's exhausting revelations. Rather than wait for morning's clarity, he chose to act on the assumption that whoever had written those words might still attempt to keep the promised rendezvous, even with their intended recipient now beyond all earthly appointments. Miss Hartwell found herself included in this evening's expedition through the vicar's thoughtful suggestion that Mrs. Ashford might benefit from another woman's presence during what promised to be a difficult interview. She accepted this invitation with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose curiosity had been thoroughly aroused by the day's accumulating mysteries. As they approached Rosemere House through the gathering dusk, the Georgian facade seemed to hold its secrets close, its windows glowing with lamplight that cast more shadows than illumination. Mrs. Ashford received them in the drawing-room with the composed dignity that had served her throughout this trying day. When Inspector Lennox explained his intention to observe the pantry door mentioned in the note, her reaction provided the first crack in her carefully maintained composure. A slight tightening around her eyes, a momentary pause before nodding her consent, suggested that the location held significance beyond its mundane domestic purpose. She summoned Mrs. Bligh, the housekeeper, whose iron-grey demeanour and compressed lips spoke of someone accustomed to keeping household secrets inviolate. The pantry itself proved to be a square, practical room with stone floors and a door opening onto the garden path. Mrs. Bligh's tour revealed nothing obviously suspicious, yet Miss Hartwell noted the excessive tidiness that spoke of recent, nervous cleaning. The shelves bore the expected provisions and preserves, but their arrangement had the studied perfection of someone who had taken unusual care to ensure everything appeared normal. When Inspector Lennox requested that the room remain undisturbed, Mrs. Bligh's hesitation lasted a fraction too long for complete innocence. They settled into their surveillance positions as 8 o'clock tolled from St. Bartholomew's Tower. Inspector Lennox positioned himself near the pantry door, while Constable Reeves took up station in the shrubbery outside. Miss Hartwell accepted Mrs. Bligh's offer of the adjacent scullery, where she could observe while maintaining the domestic pretense of preparing tea for the household during this stressful evening. The house settled into that particular quiet of large buildings at night, filled with the small sounds of settling timber and distant clocks marking time's inexorable passage. The wait proved mercifully brief. 10 minutes past the appointed hour. The soft scrape of footsteps on gravel announced an approach that was both cautious and determined. The pantry door's latch lifted with the careful pressure of someone familiar with its mechanism, rising slowly as if testing for resistance. Inspector Lennox's hand signals were unnecessary. Even Miss Hartwell's knitting needles fell silent as tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. When Lennox pulled the door wide and reached for the intruder, the figure's reaction spoke of preparation and athleticism. A sharp twist freed them from the inspector's grasp, followed by rapid flight along the hedge line toward the garden's darker recesses. Constable Reeves's pursuit through the shrubbery produced sounds of determined chase, but ultimately ended in frustration as their quarry escaped over the gardener's wall with the agility of someone who had planned their route carefully. The physical evidence left behind told its own story. Fresh scuff marks on the threshold showed where rubber soles had pivoted and slipped on the stone, leaving behind a tiny curl of material that spoke of haste and miscalculation. More intriguingly, the night air had carried with it a faint but distinctive scent, medicinal and sharp, like antiseptic tempered with something sweeter. The odor dissipated quickly in the pantry's cooler atmosphere, but its presence suggested their mysterious visitor carried the professional associations of someone accustomed to such preparations. Inside the pantry, careful examination revealed signs of recent disturbance beneath the surface tidiness. A strip of dark cloth, stained with the telltale silver-gray smudge that photographers acquire on careless fingers, had been pushed hastily behind a baking powder tin. More significantly, pale residue along the stone grooves near a low cupboard bore the characteristic appearance of photographic fixer that had evaporated and crystallized, evidence of chemical processes that had no legitimate place in a domestic pantry. Mrs. Bly's responses to questioning carried the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed her answers. Her insistence that only she, the cook, and the housemaid used the pantry came too quickly, while her denial of any recent alterations was contradicted by her involuntary glance toward the cupboard that would soon yield its secrets. When Inspector Lennox discovered the hidden compartment behind loose bricks, the contents provided the key to understanding the pressures that had been building toward this tragic conclusion. The shallow tray stained with developer, the photographic tongs, and, most crucially, the envelope containing a single contact print painted a picture of secrets carefully preserved and recently discovered. The photograph itself, though decades old, carried immediate relevance to the present crisis. It showed the pantry door in its younger days before the ivy had grown to its current height, with two figures whose relationship was clearly more intimate than propriety would have sanctioned. The man in the photograph, his face partially turned but his profile unmistakable, wore a signet ring bearing the chevrons of the Ashford family crest. The young woman beside him, dressed in a maid's uniform, gazed at the camera with the mixture of pride and fear that spoke of secrets shared and consequences anticipated. The inscription on the back, written in faded ink, read simply, "Rosemere, Easter Monday, 1908. Mrs. Ashford's reaction to seeing this image provided the emotional climax to the evening's revelations. Her composure, which had weathered police questioning and household disruption, finally showed signs of strain as she recognized the implications of Mr. Vale's discovery. Her explanation came in measured tones that spoke of long-carried burdens and difficult choices made in circumstances beyond her control. The photograph documented an indiscretion involving her late husband's father, she explained, part of a collection of family materials that had been sold at auction years earlier to address financial difficulties. She had hoped these embarrassing remnants of past scandals had been dispersed beyond recovery, but Mr. Vale's antiquarian interests had apparently led him to acquire items with uncomfortable relevance to current residents. His approach to her about these discoveries had been couched in terms of historical preservation and professional responsibility. But the underlying implications were clear to anyone who understood how such revelations might affect property ownership and social standing in a small community. The discovery of a torn paper fragment near the garden wall added another layer to the evening's mysteries. The letterhead, though partially obscured, showed enough letters to suggest professional correspondence, while the penciled notations included references to timing and alternative plans that spoke of coordination and backup arrangements. The handwriting was hurried but educated, suggesting someone accustomed to making quick notes during busy professional activities. As the formal investigation of the pantry concluded and security arrangements were made for the remainder of the night, Miss Hartwell found herself reflecting on the evening's revelations with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. The photographer's death was clearly connected to his discovery of historical materials that threatened current residents, but the complexity of the relationships involved suggested that simple blackmail was only part of the story. Walking home through the quiet village streets, Miss Hartwell considered the accumulating evidence with the methodical attention she brought to her most challenging knitting patterns. The evening's intruder had demonstrated familiarity with Rosemere House and its grounds, suggesting either current access or detailed knowledge gained through legitimate visits. The medicinal scent that had accompanied their presence pointed toward professional associations, while the rubber heel marks matched those found at the scene of the original crime. Most significantly, the careful preparation evident in the pantry's hidden photographic materials spoke of someone who understood both the technical aspects of developing images and the domestic geography of the house well enough to establish a secret workspace. The timing of Mr. Vale's death, occurring just as he prepared to reveal his discoveries, suggested that someone had been monitoring his activities closely enough to intervene at the crucial moment. As she settled into her cottage for the night, Miss Hartwell reflected that tomorrow would bring new developments as the official investigation grappled with these latest revelations. Timothy Ashford's obvious anxiety and transparent nervousness had made him an easy target for suspicion, but the evening's events suggested that the real perpetrator possessed far more sophistication and local knowledge than a distressed young man could command. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone anticipated, freezing in time not just faces and poses, but the moment when carefully buried secrets demanded their terrible reckoning. The village would wake to news of the night's dramatic events, and the gossip that had already begun to flow in predictable channels would undoubtedly intensify. Yet Miss Hartwell suspected that beneath the surface of speculation and official pronouncements, the true pattern of guilt and innocence remained to be fully revealed. The morning would bring fresh challenges to her understanding of human nature, and she looked forward to the delicate work of separating truth from the carefully constructed deceptions that had led to this moment of violence in their peaceful corner of England. Morning brought with it the sort of crystalline clarity that often follows momentous events, as if the very air had been purged by the previous evening's revelations. Miss Hartwell rose with her customary punctuality and found herself drawn to her kitchen window overlooking the village green, where the subtle alterations in daily routine spoke eloquently of a community grappling with extraordinary circumstances. Dr. Fleming's morning rounds had commenced unusually early, his dark bicycle already visible outside the Thornton cottage, where elderly Mrs. Thornton had been managing her rheumatism with increasing difficulty. More significantly, his route appeared to encompass an extended circuit past Rosemere House, where the morning light revealed fresh wheel tracks in the carefully maintained gravel drive. The arrival of Inspector Lennox at her cottage door shortly after 8 o'clock came as no surprise to Miss Hartwell, who had anticipated that the previous evening's discoveries would require additional perspective from someone intimately familiar with the village's intricate web of relationships and unspoken understandings. His request for her assistance was diplomatically phrased in terms of understanding local customs and family connections, but she recognized the deeper truth that official investigation often overlooked the subtle currents of human behavior that drove otherwise rational people toward desperate actions. Their purposeful walk toward the church hall, where the inspector intended to examine Mr. Vale's photographic equipment under better illumination, provided Miss Hartwell with an opportunity to share her observations about the accumulating details that had been troubling her since the tragedy. The missing photographic plate particularly concerned her, as its absence suggested someone had deliberately removed specific evidence rather than simply disturbing the scene in panic or confusion. The precision with which the camera lens had been capped spoke of familiarity with photographic equipment, while the small puncture in the focusing cloth indicated someone had been positioned very close to the apparatus during those crucial moments before the flash. At the hall, Inspector Lennox's methodical examination of the photographic apparatus revealed evidence that had been overlooked during the previous day's emotional turmoil. Miss Hartwell observed with particular interest how the camera's focusing rail bore a penciled mark at precisely 3.5 feet, a measurement that seemed oddly intimate for a group portrait that would typically require a much greater distance. The mark itself showed signs of repeated use, a pale groove in the varnish that suggested this particular setting had been employed frequently. When they examined the plate holders secured in the vestry cupboard, she noted immediately that one had been replaced in reverse orientation, its dark slide notch turned toward the wrong edge. This was precisely the sort of error an amateur might make under pressure, or the deliberate sign that someone accustomed to maintaining order might employ when working under extraordinary strain. The discovery of Mr. Vale's research materials at Ivy Cottage transformed their understanding of the photographer's activities in Meadowbrook from casual historical interest into something far more systematic and potentially threatening. Behind a cleverly concealed panel in his equipment case, they uncovered a comprehensive collection of documents that painted a picture of methodical investigation extending across decades of village history. Property deeds, birth certificates, marriage records, and, most significantly, a detailed genealogical chart showing the complex relationships between founding families revealed the true scope of Mr. Vale's scholarly pursuits. The genealogical chart itself represented months of painstaking research, with colored lines connecting names and dates in patterns that revealed secrets carefully buried by previous generations. The Ashford family tree showed branches that official records had never acknowledged, while property transfers dating back to the previous century indicated financial arrangements that had been deliberately obscured through complex legal mechanisms. Several entries bore question marks and marginal notations, suggesting that Mr. Vale had identified significant discrepancies requiring further investigation. Discrepancies that could potentially affect current property ownership and social standing throughout the village. Among these papers, they discovered correspondence between Mr. Vale and various record offices throughout the county, revealing his systematic approach to uncovering historical accuracy. More crucially, they found a letter from a London firm of private investigators acknowledging receipt of his commission to trace current whereabouts of individuals connected to certain historical events. The letter's careful language spoke of delicate matters requiring absolute discretion, while its references to substantial financial implications and potential legal consequences made clear that Mr. Vale's research had evolved beyond academic curiosity into areas that could dramatically impact several families' current circumstances. The revelation that sealed their understanding of the photographer's intentions came in the form of a railway ticket to London, dated for the morning after the exhibition, accompanied by the prestigious address of solicitors specializing in property law. The first-class accommodation and the firm's reputation for handling complex inheritance disputes suggested that Mr. Vale had been preparing to present his evidence to authorities capable of acting upon its legal implications. Someone had recognized that once he reached London with his documentation, the consequences for certain village residents would become irreversible, providing a desperate motive for preventing his departure at any cost. Miss Hartwell's subsequent visit to Ellery and Son ironmongers proved remarkably illuminating regarding the domestic arrangements that had facilitated the previous evening's mysterious activities. The ironmonger's pride in his comprehensive service to local residents led him to produce his order book with considerable satisfaction, revealing not only Mr. Vale's recent purchases of photographic supplies, but also several intriguing entries for Mrs. Bligh of Rosemere House. While the housekeeper's acquisition of carbolic acid might be explained by normal domestic requirements, her purchase of photographic reducer, ostensibly for silver polishing, struck Miss Hartwell as one of those domestically acceptable explanations that perfectly circumvented less acceptable truths. The casual revelation that Dr. Fleming had utilized Rosemere's pantry entrance the previous Thursday evening when summoned to attend the cook's neuralgia provided another piece of the increasingly complex puzzle. Mrs. Bligh's complaint about the lingering medicinal odor among her preserves, delivered with the genuine irritation of someone protecting her domain's proper atmosphere, carried the unmistakable ring of unvarnished truth. Her mention of leaving the door ajar to clear the air suggested both familiarity with the doctor's professional sense and intimate knowledge of the pantry's ventilation characteristics. Miss Hartwell's subsequent encounter with Daphne Lytton in the lane beyond the village green revealed the young woman's growing awareness that the investigation was moving beyond simple accusations against her fiancé. Daphne's admission that she had visited Ivy Cottage 2 days earlier to plead with Mr. Vale for Timothy's peace of mind painted a picture of mounting pressure within the Ashford household. More significantly, when Miss Hartwell gently inquired whether Daphne had recognized the medicinal scent in the pantry the previous evening, the girl's sharp reaction and whispered confirmation that it resembled the clean, distinctive odor that clung to Dr. Fleming's sleeves provided crucial corroboration of her growing suspicions. The torn paper fragment discovered near the garden wall began to assume greater significance as Miss Hartwell recalled her previous conversations with Dr. Fleming about the new record-keeping protocols at the district hospital. His complaints about the specialized paper required for certain patient charts, with its distinctive texture and durability, now resonated with her memory of the fragment's unusual feel. The precise, almost coded nature of the penciled notations suggested not casual correspondence, but the professional shorthand employed by someone accustomed to making rapid, accurate records under pressure. As afternoon approached and Inspector Lennox continued his formal questioning of Timothy Ashford, Miss Hartwell reflected on the morning's accumulating evidence with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts were being systematically confirmed. The official investigation remained focused on the obvious suspect, a nervous young man whose transparent anxiety and unconvincing explanations made him an easy target for official suspicion. However, the true pattern emerging from careful observation pointed toward someone far more sophisticated, someone with intimate knowledge of both photographic processes and Rosemere House's domestic geography. Someone whose professional training provided both opportunity and the technical knowledge necessary to orchestrate such carefully planned deception. The photographer's death was clearly connected to his historical research and its potential legal ramifications, but the complexity of the relationships involved suggested that the true motive extended beyond simple self-preservation into areas of professional reputation and community standing that raised the stakes far beyond what anyone had initially comprehended. Someone in their peaceful village possessed the knowledge, opportunity, and desperation necessary to commit murder in order to prevent historical truth from destroying carefully constructed lives built upon foundations of deliberate concealment. As evening approached and the formal machinery of justice continued its methodical progress, Miss Hartwell found herself looking forward to the delicate work of separating truth from the carefully constructed deceptions that had led to this moment of violence. The photographer's last exposure had captured more than faces and poses. It had frozen in time the instant when decades of buried secrets would demand their terrible reckoning, and she suspected that before this matter reached its resolution, the true nature of human desperation would be revealed in all its calculated complexity. The late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Hartwell's cottage in the form of Daphne Lytton, whose usual composed demeanor had given way to barely contained agitation. The young woman clutched a brown paper parcel against her chest as if it contained something both precious and dangerous. Her cheeks flushed from what appeared to be a hurried journey through the village lanes. When Miss Hartwell invited her inside, Daphne's explanation tumbled forth in the rushed manner of someone who had rehearsed difficult words but found them no easier for the practice. She had returned to Rosemere House that morning to offer assistance to Mrs. Ashford, who had been struggling to maintain her usual household routines in the aftermath of the tragedy. While helping Mrs. Bligh reorganize the dining room sideboard, a dropped napkin ring had rolled beneath the heavy oak settle in the hallway. Reaching underneath to retrieve it, her fingers had encountered something that clearly did not belong in such a location. The object she had discovered, wrapped hastily in a tea towel and shoved far back against the wall, was unmistakably a photographic plate holder. Miss Hartwell examined the holder with the careful attention she brought to her most delicate knitting patterns. The brass corners showed recent handling, with faint smudges that spoke of hasty manipulation, while the dark slide had been inserted with less than perfect precision. Most tellingly, this was clearly the missing 8th holder from Mr. Vale's inventory, the one whose absence had troubled her since the previous day's examination of his equipment. Someone had removed this plate from the scene of the crime and hidden it at Rosemere House, suggesting not only guilt but intimate knowledge of the household's geography. The decision to develop the plate could not be postponed despite the emotional difficulty such an undertaking would present. Inspector Lennox, summoned by a hastily dispatched message, agreed that Mr. Vale's makeshift darkroom at Ivy Cottage provided their best opportunity to discover what secrets the hidden plate might reveal. The cottage felt unnaturally quiet as they made their preparations, its owner's absence lending an almost sacred quality to the photographic equipment that remained precisely as he had left it. Working by the dim red glow of the safe light, Miss Hartwell's experienced hands guided the development process with the sort of practiced efficiency that spoke of long familiarity with such procedures. The image that emerged from the chemical bath was not the group portrait they had expected, but something far more intimate and incriminating. The camera's close focusing had captured a tight view of hands and equipment, revealing details that the photographer had never intended to document. The plate showed a man's hand reaching toward the camera's focusing cloth, the fingers clearly visible and the wrist bearing a distinctive leather watch strap of military design. More significantly, the hand grasped what appeared to be a small, dark object partially concealed within the folds of the black cloth. The positioning suggested someone who had been standing very close to the camera during those crucial moments before the flash, close enough to manipulate the equipment while maintaining the pretense of observing the demonstration. Additional details in the photograph provided crucial context for understanding what had occurred. A visiting card lay partially visible on the equipment table, its penciled notation showing what appeared to be a time reference. The edge of a sleeve showed in the frame's corner, displaying a pattern that Miss Hartwell recognized from her careful observations of village residents' habitual dress. Most tellingly, the hand's position and the angle of approach suggested someone who understood photographic equipment well enough to work with it efficiently under pressure. Inspector Lennox studied the developed image with the methodical attention of a professional investigator, noting each detail while maintaining the careful neutrality that had served him throughout this complex case. The evidence was certainly suggestive, but he understood the difference between compelling circumstantial proof and the sort of definitive identification that would satisfy a court of law. The photograph raised important questions about who had been closest to the camera during the fatal demonstration, but it would require additional corroboration to transform suspicion into certainty. Miss Hartwell's subsequent investigation into the domestic arrangements at Rosemere House revealed additional layers of complexity beneath the surface of normal household routine. Her conversation with Mrs. Bly about the pantry's recent cleaning disclosed that someone had been unusually particular about removing all traces of chemical odors from the storage areas. The housekeeper's pride in her thoroughness inadvertently revealed that she had been specifically instructed to eliminate any lingering medicinal scents that might have accumulated during recent visits by Dr. Fleming. The doctor's professional calls at Rosemere had indeed become more frequent in recent weeks, ostensibly to attend to various minor ailments among the staff. However, Mrs. Bly's casual mention that he often entered through the pantry door to avoid disturbing the household's formal routines provided insight into how someone might have gained regular access to the photographic facilities hidden within that domestic space. His familiarity with the house's service areas and his medical authority would have made such visits appear entirely routine to anyone who observed them. Miss Hartwell's careful inquiry about the timing of these medical visits revealed a pattern that aligned troublingly with the development of Mr. Vale's historical research. Dr. Fleming's calls had increased in frequency precisely during the period when the photographer had been making his most significant discoveries about village family histories. The coincidence suggested either remarkable medical diligence or a more calculated interest in monitoring activities that might threaten carefully guarded secrets. The evening brought an incident that added urgency to their investigation, while confirming Miss Hartwell's growing suspicions about the domestic conspiracy that had facilitated the photographer's murder. A small fire in Rosemare's pantry, quickly extinguished but significant in its implications, had clearly been intended to destroy remaining evidence of the photographic activities that had taken place there. The charred fragments that survived the flames included portions of the specialized paper used for hospital records, its distinctive texture unmistakable even in its damaged state. Dr. Fleming's presence at Rosemere during the fire, ostensibly to treat Mrs. Ashford for smoke inhalation, provided him with the opportunity to assess what evidence might have survived his attempt at destruction. His professional composure during the emergency was exemplary, but Miss Hartwell noted how his attention seemed divided between his patient's welfare and the contents of the damaged pantry. His suggestions for ventilating the affected area showed a knowledge of chemical processes that extended beyond normal medical training into areas more typically associated with photographic work. As the household settled after the evening's excitement, Miss Hartwell reflected on the accumulating evidence with the satisfaction of someone whose patient observation was finally yielding definitive results. The hidden photographic plate had provided crucial visual evidence of someone's presence near the camera during the fatal moments, while the domestic arrangements at Rosemere revealed how that same person had gained the access and knowledge necessary to plan such a sophisticated crime. The photographer's death was clearly the result of careful planning rather than spontaneous violence, executed by someone who understood both the technical aspects of the crime and the domestic geography necessary to conceal the evidence afterward. Dr. Fleming's medical training provided him with knowledge of chemicals and timing that could easily be adapted to murderous purposes, while his professional relationship with the Ashford household had given him the access and authority necessary to establish the secret photographic laboratory in their pantry. Most significantly, the pattern of evidence suggested that the doctor had been monitoring Mr. Vale's research activities closely enough to understand when intervention became necessary to prevent devastating revelations from reaching London. The anonymous note that had lured the photographer to his fatal appointment bore all the hallmarks of someone who understood both the legal implications of the historical evidence and the domestic routines that would provide opportunity for private confrontation. As Miss Hartwell prepared for bed in her cottage, she reflected that tomorrow would likely bring the resolution of this complex case through the careful presentation of evidence that had been accumulating since the tragedy began. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone anticipated, providing visual proof of guilt that no amount of professional authority or social standing could overcome. The village would soon learn that their trusted physician had been driven to murder by the sort of misguided compassion that transformed healing knowledge into an instrument of death, motivated by secrets that seemed more important than human life itself. The investigation had revealed not merely the mechanics of murder, but the dangerous intersection of professional knowledge and moral arrogance that had made such a crime seem preferable to facing the consequences of historical truth. Dr. Fleming's careful planning and execution demonstrated how even the most respected members of society could be driven to desperate measures when their carefully constructed lives faced exposure through the inexorable progress of historical investigation. The morning following the pantry fire brought Inspector Lennox to Miss Hartwell's cottage with the sort of methodical determination that spoke of a man who had spent the night reviewing evidence and finding it insufficient for his purposes. His request for her assistance was diplomatically phrased, but she recognized the deeper truth that official investigation, however thorough, sometimes required the sort of patient observation that came naturally to those who had spent decades watching human nature reveal itself in small, telling details. Their return to the scene of the crime proved more illuminating than either had anticipated. In the clear morning light, Miss Hartwell's examination of the photographic equipment revealed subtleties that had been overlooked during the previous day's emotional turmoil. The camera's focusing rail bore a penciled mark at precisely the distance required for intimate portraiture rather than group photography, while the arrangement of chemical bottles showed signs of recent handling that extended beyond what the demonstration would have required. Most significantly, she noted how the lens had been kept with the automatic precision of someone thoroughly familiar with photographic equipment, the sort of reflexive care that spoke of long practice rather than casual acquaintance. The missing 8th photographic plate continued to trouble her, particularly when combined with Inspector Lennox's discovery that Mr. Vale's inventory listed specific exposure sequences that were now incomplete. Someone had deliberately removed evidence, but the selection showed discrimination rather than panic, suggesting familiarity with both photographic processes and the significance of particular images. When they examined the plate holders more carefully, Miss Hartwell observed that one had been replaced in reverse orientation, its dark slide notch turned toward the wrong edge. This was precisely the sort of error someone might make when working under pressure, or the deliberate sign that a methodical person might employ when forced to work hastily. Their investigation took an unexpected turn when Colonel Bradshaw arrived at the hall in considerable agitation, bearing news that cast the previous evening's events in an entirely different light. A Webley revolver that had been secured in his bureau since the war had gone missing sometime during the past week, though his embarrassment at reporting the loss had delayed his disclosure until conscience overcame pride. The colonel's military bearing could not quite conceal his distress at what he perceived as inexcusable carelessness with a weapon, though his description of the revolver's specifications matched no evidence found at the scene of Mr. Vale's death. Miss Hartwell's subsequent conversation with young Tommy Hartwell, the baker's son whose afternoon deliveries took him past Rosemere's service areas, provided crucial verification of the timeline that had been troubling her since the investigation began. The boy's account, delivered with the straightforward honesty of someone who regulated his activities by church bells and established routines, placed Dr. Fleming's bicycle at Rosemere's pantry door during the precise period when the doctor claimed to be attending patients elsewhere in the village. This discrepancy could not be explained by innocent confusion or faulty memory, suggesting deliberate deception about his whereabouts during crucial hours. The revelation that transformed Miss Hartwell's understanding of the domestic arrangements at Rosemere came through her careful inquiry into Mrs. Bly's background and qualifications. The housekeeper's defensive responses about photographic equipment gradually revealed a history that extended far beyond normal domestic service. A faded photograph, discovered among the kitchen memorabilia, showed Mrs. Bly as a young woman, identified in careful script as assistant housemaid, 1902, standing proudly beside a camera identical to the one now stored in Rosemere's attic. Her knowledge of photographic processes, acquired during an era when such skills were considered fashionable accomplishments for ambitious servants, had clearly been maintained and developed over the intervening decades. This discovery cast the pantry arrangements in an entirely new light, suggesting that Mrs. Bly's role had extended far beyond simply providing workspace for Dr. Fleming's supposed preservation activities. Her intimate knowledge of both photographic techniques and Rosemere's domestic geography would have made her an invaluable collaborator in any scheme requiring technical expertise and local access. The medicinal odors detected in the pantry took on new significance when considered alongside the specialized chemicals required for photographic development, creating a perfect cover for activities that had nothing to do with medical practice. Miss Hartwell's decision to set a subtle trap was inspired by her growing certainty that the true perpetrator possessed both technical knowledge and desperate motivation to eliminate remaining evidence. She mentioned casually, during her afternoon visit to Rosemere, that she had discovered an undeveloped plate at Ivy Cottage that might contain crucial information about the crime. Her description of leaving this fictional plate to clear in a solution on her scullery window sill was delivered with the sort of domestic detail that would mean nothing to the innocent, but everything to someone familiar with photographic processes and desperate to prevent further revelations. The reaction to her carefully planted information confirmed her suspicions about the complexity of the conspiracy she was unraveling. Mrs. Ashford's visible relief, followed immediately by renewed anxiety, suggested someone who understood both the potential value and danger of photographic evidence. Dr. Fleming's controlled response masked a calculation about timing and opportunity that spoke of someone accustomed to making rapid decisions under pressure. Most tellingly, Mrs. Bligh's offer to provide supper so that Miss Hartwell would not be disturbed during her evening work carried the sort of helpful efficiency that perfectly concealed more sinister intentions. As evening approached and Miss Hartwell prepared for the confrontation she was certain would come, she reflected on the intricate web of relationships and motivations that had led to Mr. Vale's death. The photographer's historical research had threatened not just individual reputations, but the carefully constructed foundation upon which several lives had been built. Dr. Fleming's growing attachment to Mrs. Ashford had gradually transformed professional concern into something far more personal and dangerous, while Mrs. Bligh's long service at Rosemere had given her both the skills and the loyalty necessary to become an accomplice in desperate measures. The true tragedy lay not in the crime itself, but in how noble impulses had been corrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Dr. Fleming's medical training, which should have reinforced respect for human life, had instead provided him with the knowledge necessary to commit murder while concealing the evidence. Mrs. Bligh's domestic efficiency and technical skills had been perverted into instruments of deception, while Mrs. Ashford's genuine distress had provided the emotional justification for actions that no rational person could defend. As Miss Hartwell settled into her chair by the front window, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm, she prepared to witness the final act of this complex drama. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone anticipated, freezing in time not just faces and poses, but the moment when carefully buried secrets would demand their terrible reckoning. Tomorrow would bring resolution, but tonight she was content to wait for truth to reveal itself through the sort of patient observation that had served her well throughout a lifetime of understanding human nature in all its tragic complexity. The village lay quiet around her cottage, but Miss Hartwell knew that beneath the surface of peaceful domesticity, desperate minds were calculating their final moves in a game where the stakes had become literally matters of life and death. The photographer's death had been merely the opening gambit in a struggle that would ultimately expose the dangerous intersection of professional knowledge, personal attachment, and moral arrogance that could drive even the most respected members of society toward actions they would never have imagined themselves capable of contemplating. The evening brought the sort of expectant quiet that settles over villages when significant events hang in the balance, and Miss Hartwell found herself positioned by her front window with the satisfaction of someone whose patient planning was about to bear fruit. She had arranged her modest trap with the sort of domestic attention to detail that would appear entirely innocent to casual observation, while proving irresistible to someone desperate enough to risk everything for the elimination of evidence. A single photographic plate, carefully prepared with convincing chemical stains and positioned on her scullery windowsill, would serve as the final test of guilt for whoever possessed both the knowledge to recognize its significance and the desperation to act upon that recognition. The soft scrape of footsteps on gravel announced her visitor's approach shortly after 10 o'clock, moving with the cautious determination of someone who had weighed risks carefully and found the potential consequences of inaction more terrifying than those of discovery. The figure that emerged from the shadow of her garden hedge carried the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to moving efficiently through domestic spaces, and Miss Hartwell noted with particular interest how the approaching steps seemed to know exactly which flagstones would bear weight silently and which might betray an unwelcome presence. When the scullery window rose with the practiced ease of someone familiar with its particular mechanism, Miss Hartwell spoke without rising from her chair, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had served her throughout a lifetime of managing delicate situations. "I should not recommend disturbing that solution, Mrs. Bly. The chemicals require several more hours to work properly, and interruption at this stage would quite spoil the result." The figure in her kitchen froze with the stillness of complete shock before turning to face her, resignation and calculation warring in features that had spent decades learning to reveal nothing of their owner's true thoughts. Mrs. Bly's response came with the controlled dignity of someone who understood that denial would be futile, but retained enough professional pride to maintain her composure, even in defeat. "It had to be done, Miss Hartwell. Not for myself, you understand, but for the family I've served these 30 years. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some truths do more harm than justice when they are dragged into the light." Her explanation carried the weight of genuine conviction, revealing not merely complicity, but the sort of misguided loyalty that could transform domestic efficiency into an instrument of deception. The arrival of Constable Reeves, who had been maintaining a discreet watch at Miss Hartwell's quiet request, provided the official authority necessary to transform private confrontation into formal questioning. Inspector Lennox followed moments later, having positioned himself at the lane's end to await developments that his experience suggested would inevitably come. His examination of the items Mrs. Bly had intended to remove revealed not the crucial photographic evidence she had expected, but clear water tinted with ordinary ink, a deception that spoke eloquently of Miss Hartwell's understanding of human psychology under pressure. The housekeeper's subsequent explanation revealed layers of complexity that extended far beyond simple domestic conspiracy into areas of technical expertise and long-standing family loyalty that had been gradually corrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Her admission that she had maintained photographic skills acquired during her youth, combined with her intimate knowledge of Rosemare's domestic geography, painted a picture of someone uniquely qualified to assist in activities requiring both discretion and technical competence. The secret laboratory, established in the pantry, had been her creation, utilizing equipment and chemicals that could be disguised as normal household supplies, while serving purposes that had nothing to do with domestic maintenance. More significantly, Mrs. Bly's careful responses to Inspector Lennox's questioning revealed the extent to which she had been monitoring and facilitating Dr. Fleming's activities at Rosemere House. Her description of his frequent visits, ostensibly for medical purposes but actually providing opportunity for clandestine research and evidence destruction, demonstrated how professional authority could be exploited to deflect suspicion while pursuing objectives that violated every principle of medical ethics. The medicinal scents that had lingered in the pantry after his visits had been deliberately masked by her domestic cleaning, creating the perfect cover for activities that required both chemical knowledge and access to photographic equipment. The evening's revelations took an unexpected turn with the arrival of Colonel Bradshaw, whose military bearing could not quite conceal his distress at discovering his missing Webley revolver, wrapped in materials that clearly implicated someone with intimate knowledge of his domestic routines. The weapon's condition spoke of hasty cleaning rather than professional maintenance, while the wrapping bore the distinctive stitching that Mrs. Bly had employed in her various domestic repairs. This discovery suggested not merely the theft of a convenient weapon, but the deliberate attempt to implicate the colonel in crimes he had never contemplated, using his military background and explosive temperament as a shield for more calculated violence. Miss Hartwell's examination of the revolver's wrapping revealed details that connected seemingly disparate elements of the conspiracy into a coherent pattern of deception and misdirection. The cloth bore traces of the specialized chemicals used in photographic processing, while the stitching showed the sort of professional competence that spoke of long practice in domestic repairs. Most significantly, the timing of the weapon's placement suggested coordination between multiple parties, with Mrs. Bligh's technical skills supporting Dr. Fleming's more sophisticated planning, while both worked to protect interests that extended beyond their individual welfare. The psychological pressure of accumulated evidence gradually revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had led to Mr. Vale's death. As Mrs. Bligh's careful responses disclosed not merely her own involvement, but the extent to which she had been facilitating Dr. Fleming's increasingly desperate attempts to prevent historical truth from destroying carefully constructed lives. Her loyalty to the Ashford family had been exploited by someone who understood how domestic devotion could be transformed into complicity in activities that violated every principle of moral behavior. The housekeeper's technical expertise had provided the means, while her emotional attachment had supplied the motivation for actions that she would never have contemplated under normal circumstances. As the formal questioning continued and the evidence accumulated into an increasingly damning pattern, Miss Hartwell reflected on the tragic irony that skills acquired for legitimate purposes had been perverted into instruments of deception and ultimately murder. Mrs. Bligh's photographic expertise, developed during an era when such accomplishments were considered fashionable for ambitious servants, had been maintained and refined over decades of service before being corrupted into support for activities that betrayed every principle of honest domestic management. The intersection of technical knowledge and emotional manipulation had created the perfect conditions for conspiracy, with professional authority providing cover for actions that no rational person could defend. The evening's confrontation had revealed not merely the mechanics of murder, but the complex web of relationships and motivations that had made such desperate measures seem preferable to facing the consequences of historical truth. Dr. Fleming's medical knowledge and Mrs. Bligh's domestic expertise had combined to create a conspiracy sophisticated enough to deceive official investigation while maintaining the appearance of normal village life. Yet Miss Hartwell understood that the true revelation still awaited, as the psychological pressure she had applied would inevitably drive the principal perpetrator toward a final confrontation where all remaining secrets would be exposed to the unforgiving light of justice. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone anticipated, freezing in time not just faces and poses, but the moment when carefully buried secrets would demand their terrible reckoning. Tomorrow would bring the final act of this complex drama, as the accumulated evidence and psychological pressure combined to force a complete confession from someone who had believed that medical authority and careful planning could conceal the ultimate violation of the trust society placed in those sworn to preserve rather than destroy human life. The morning brought Dr. Fleming to Miss Hartwell's cottage, with the sort of careful composure that spoke of a man who had spent the night weighing his options and finding them all equally unpalatable. His explanation for the early visit carried the professional courtesy that had served him throughout his medical career, expressing concern for any lingering shock from the previous evening's disturbance and offering his services, should her nerves require attention. Miss Hartwell received him with the gracious hospitality of someone who had been expecting precisely this visit, leading him through to her sitting room where the morning light fell across a carefully arranged tableau of borrowed photographic equipment. The articles from Mr. Vale's collection lay on her side table with studied casualness, the lens cap and focusing cloth positioned beside a single plate holder wrapped in brown paper. As she prepared tea with deliberate domesticity, Miss Hartwell mentioned her confusion about photographic procedures, fumbling slightly with the lens mechanism while confessing she could never remember the proper sequence of operations. Dr. Fleming's response revealed more than any direct questioning might have achieved, as his hands moved with unconscious precision to demonstrate the correct technique his fingers finding the focus rail's 3.5-foot mark with the familiarity of long practice. His casual mention of the distance required for close portrait work came without apparent thought, the sort of technical knowledge that spoke of extensive experience with photographic equipment rather than casual observation. Miss Hartwell noted how his attention lingered on the wrapped plate holder and how his offer to assist with moving it revealed the careful calculation of someone who recognized an object that should not be where it appeared. When she mentioned having discovered an additional undeveloped plate at Ivy Cottage, his controlled reaction carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what such evidence might contain. The conversation that followed revealed layers of justification and moral complexity as Dr. Fleming spoke of duty and the terrible choices that circumstances sometimes imposed upon conscientious individuals. His references to Timothy's welfare and Mrs. Ashford's vulnerable position painted a picture of someone who had gradually transformed professional concern into personal crusade, while his careful avoidance of direct admission demonstrated the psychological sophistication that had made his deception so effective. Miss Hartwell listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that confession must emerge naturally from the pressure of accumulated evidence rather than direct accusation. When she produced the developed photograph from its envelope, setting it quietly on the table between them, the image spoke more eloquently than any words might have managed. The plate showed a man's hand reaching through the camera's focusing cloth, the distinctive military watch strap clearly visible, while the fingers grasped what appeared to be a small, metallic object positioned precisely where it could interfere with the camera's mechanism. The angle and positioning suggested someone who had been standing very close to the apparatus during those crucial moments before the fatal flash, close enough to manipulate the equipment while maintaining the pretense of innocent observation. Dr. Fleming's examination of the photograph carried the sort of professional detachment that had served him throughout his medical career, but Miss Hartwell observed how his fingers trembled slightly as he traced the image's details. His admission that military straps became comfortable with long wear came without conscious thought, the sort of unguarded response that revealed more than hours of careful questioning might have achieved. When she mentioned Mr. Vale's habit of marking focus distances with pencil grooves, his acknowledgement that familiarity with such measurements would allow someone to work efficiently even under difficult conditions provided the final confirmation of his intimate knowledge of the photographer's equipment. The technical details of the crime emerged gradually as Fleming's carefully constructed defenses crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. His explanation revealed how medical knowledge had been perverted into an instrument of death, as his understanding of human anatomy and chemical reactions had enabled him to create a weapon that would appear to be an accident involving photographic equipment. The small explosive charge he had concealed within the camera's mechanism had been designed to detonate during the magnesium flash, creating the sharp crack that witnesses had mistaken for gunfire while delivering a fatal injury that would be attributed to the dangerous chemicals Mr. Vale routinely employed. The positioning required for such precise timing had necessitated Fleming's presence immediately beside the camera during the demonstration, his medical authority providing the perfect cover for movements that would have appeared suspicious from anyone else. His familiarity with the equipment, gained through careful observation during previous visits to Ivy Cottage, had enabled him to work efficiently within the focusing cloth, while maintaining the appearance of casual assistance with the photographer's arrangements. The missing plate holder had been removed immediately after the crime, containing the visual evidence of his presence that would have made denial impossible. Mrs. Bly's role in the conspiracy had extended far beyond simple domestic complicity, as her photographic expertise had been essential for both planning the crime and concealing evidence afterward. Her establishment of the secret laboratory in Rosemare's pantry had provided the workspace necessary for developing the incriminating plate and assessing its contents, while her intimate knowledge of the house's routines had facilitated the meetings and evidence destruction that followed. The medicinal scents that had lingered after Fleming's visits had provided perfect cover for chemical processes that had nothing to do with legitimate medical treatment. The motive that had driven such desperate measures became clear as Fleming described his growing awareness of the threat Mr. Vale's research posed to people he had come to regard as his personal responsibility. The historical evidence the photographer had uncovered suggested irregularities in property transfers that could potentially invalidate Mrs. Ashford's ownership of Rosemere House, leaving her destitute and destroying Timothy's inheritance prospects. Fleming's attachment to the widow had transformed professional concern into something far more personal and dangerous, while his medical training had provided him with both the knowledge and the authority necessary to act upon his misguided protective instincts. Inspector Lennox's arrival provided the official framework necessary to transform private confession into formal procedure, his presence lending gravity to admissions that might otherwise have remained between individuals bound by social convention. His patient questioning revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, while maintaining the respectful tone appropriate to someone whose professional standing had made his fall from grace particularly tragic. The accumulated evidence spoke eloquently of guilt, but the inspector's approach acknowledged the complex motivations that had driven an otherwise honorable man toward actions that violated every principle of his medical oath. As the formal procedures concluded and Dr. Fleming departed under police escort, Miss Hartwell reflected on the tragic transformation of healing knowledge into an instrument of destruction. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone anticipated, freezing in time not just the moment of murder, but the instant when carefully buried secrets demanded their terrible reckoning. The case had revealed how noble impulses could be corrupted by circumstances beyond rational control, transforming protectiveness into paranoia and medical expertise into murderous calculation. The village would gradually return to its normal rhythms, though the scars of this revelation would remain visible for years to come in the careful way residents regarded their trusted professionals, in the subtle alterations in social relationships that followed such devastating breaches of faith. Miss Hartwell understood that the true tragedy lay not merely in the crime itself, but in the waste of knowledge and skill that should have been devoted to preserving life rather than destroying it, corrupted by the dangerous intersection of professional authority and personal attachment that had made such sophisticated deception possible. The morning's revelations had completed the pattern that had been emerging since Mr. Vale's death, confirming her suspicions about the complex web of relationships and motivations that had made murder seem preferable to facing the consequences of historical truth. As she settled back into her familiar routine, Miss Hartwell reflected that human nature remained as predictable as her knitting patterns, following established sequences that revealed themselves to patient observation despite the most careful attempts at concealment. The afternoon following Dr. Fleming's confession brought Inspector Lennox to the vicarage with the sort of quiet determination that spoke of a man intent on closing a complex case with dignity intact. His request that Mrs. Ashford, Timothy, and Daphne join him for a final discussion was phrased with the diplomatic courtesy that acknowledged their ordeal while recognizing the necessity of complete resolution. Miss Hartwell's presence was accepted as naturally as the vicar's tea service, her knitting needles clicking softly as the afternoon's revelations unfolded with the measured pace that such grave matters demanded. The gathering bore no resemblance to the dramatic confrontations of sensational fiction. Instead, truth emerged through Inspector Lennox's methodical presentation of evidence, each detail small enough to appear harmless alone, but forming together an inescapable pattern of guilt and deception. He spoke of the missing photographic plate and its damning contents, of the precise focus mark on the camera's rail and the small puncture in the bellows with its telltale singed edge. The capped lens and the reversed dark slide told their own story of hasty competence, while the medicinal scent that had lingered in Rosemare's pantry and the familiar bicycle observed at suspicious hours completed the picture of systematic planning disguised as professional duty. Mrs. Ashford listened with her hands clasped, maintaining the composed dignity that had served her throughout this ordeal. When Inspector Lennox mentioned the anonymous note and the appointment at the pantry door, her slight nod acknowledged that the meeting had been arranged without her knowledge by someone who believed he understood her troubles better than she understood them herself. Her explanation, when it came, was delivered in measured tones that spoke of long-carried burdens finally brought into daylight. The photograph from 1908 had documented more than a moment of indiscretion, she revealed. It had captured evidence of a relationship that had produced consequences carefully hidden from public knowledge through the sort of legal arrangements that wealthy families employed to protect their reputations. The young woman in the maid's uniform had left Rosemere with promises that were quietly fulfilled through payments made in distant places, ensuring that certain facts would never appear in the official records that governed property and inheritance. Mr. Vale's antiquarian interests had uncovered what generations of careful legal work had been designed to conceal, threatening not merely embarrassment, but the very foundation upon which Timothy's inheritance rested. Timothy's face paled as the implications became clear, but Daphne's steady presence beside him provided the support that would see him through this revelation and its aftermath. Inspector Lennox, demonstrating the rare quality of seeing people as well as crimes, assured the young man that legal processes existed for addressing such historical complications without destroying lives built in good faith upon imperfect foundations. Whatever untidiness the past had left behind could be resolved through proper channels that took account of years lived honestly, regardless of the circumstances that had made such honesty possible. The technical aspects of Dr. Fleming's crime emerged through careful questioning that revealed the sophisticated planning behind what had appeared to be spontaneous violence. His medical knowledge had been perverted into an understanding of precisely how explosive materials could be concealed within photographic equipment, creating a weapon that would detonate during the magnesium flash while appearing to be an accident involving dangerous chemicals. The positioning required for such precise timing had necessitated his presence immediately beside the camera during the demonstration, his professional authority providing perfect cover for movements that would have aroused suspicion from anyone else. Mrs. Bligh's role in this conspiracy extended far beyond simple domestic complicity, as her photographic expertise had been essential for both planning the crime and concealing evidence afterward. Her establishment of the secret laboratory in Rosemere's pantry had provided the workspace necessary for developing incriminating plates and assessing their contents, while her intimate knowledge of the household's routines had facilitated the meetings and evidence destruction that followed. The housekeeper's long loyalty to the Ashford family had been exploited by someone who understood how domestic devotion could be transformed into complicity in increasingly serious crimes, each step seeming reasonable when viewed in isolation, but leading inexorably toward murder when combined with desperate circumstances. As the formal discussion concluded and the participants prepared to resume their interrupted lives, Miss Hartwell reflected on the tragic waste of knowledge and skill that should have been devoted to healing rather than harm. Dr. Fleming's medical training and Mrs. Bligh's technical competence had been corrupted by misguided protectiveness, transforming noble impulses into murderous calculation, while maintaining the appearance of normal professional conduct that made such sophisticated deception possible. The village's reaction to these revelations followed predictable patterns as Meadowbrook struggled to reconcile its trust in familiar institutions with the devastating reality of betrayal by someone they had regarded as beyond suspicion. Some residents immediately sought new medical arrangements, while others declared they would never again feel comfortable around photographic equipment. Mrs. Pemberton responded to the crisis by baking additional cakes for households where she suspected nerves might be frayed, while Colonel Bradshaw walked the village green with less military precision and more thoughtful consideration for the complexities of human nature that he had previously dismissed as foreign complications. In the weeks that followed, Timothy's exoneration brought genuine relief to his supporters, though his pale composure suggested someone who had learned harsh lessons about the fragility of social standing and the dangerous power of historical truth. Daphne's protective solicitude revealed the sort of mature understanding that often emerged from confronting life's more serious challenges, while Mrs. Ashford's dignified acceptance of her altered circumstances demonstrated the resilience that had enabled her to survive previous crises with grace intact. The summer exhibition's remnants were finally cleared away as normal life attempted to reassert itself. But the memory of how quickly domestic tranquility could be shattered by buried secrets would linger in the collective consciousness like an uncomfortable reminder of human nature's darker possibilities. The prize-winning dahlias had wilted in their vases, while the cake stall bore the melancholy appearance of festivities that would never be completed. Yet it was the absence of the photography table that most eloquently testified to the tragedy that had transformed celebration into catastrophe. As autumn settled over Meadowbrook and the investigation officially concluded, Miss Hartwell found herself drawn to her cottage window overlooking the village green, where the subtle alterations in daily routine spoke of a community gradually healing from extraordinary trauma. The morning light revealed fresh patterns in the familiar landscape of village life, as residents learned to navigate relationships that had been forever changed by the revelation that even their most trusted professionals could harbor deadly secrets beneath facades of respectability and competence. Walking through the quiet evening streets, Miss Hartwell reflected that Mr. Vale's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone had anticipated, freezing in time not merely faces and poses, but the moment when carefully buried secrets demanded their terrible reckoning. The photographer's death had revealed how noble impulses could be corrupted by desperate circumstances, transforming medical knowledge into an instrument of death while maintaining the professional authority that made such sophisticated deception possible. Yet in the end, truth had emerged through the patient application of observation and logic, proving once again that human nature revealed itself in patterns as predictable as her knitting stitches, despite the most careful attempts at concealment. The case had demonstrated the dangerous intersection of professional knowledge and personal attachment, showing how even the most respected members of society could be driven to desperate measures when their carefully constructed lives faced exposure through the inexorable progress of historical investigation. As she settled into her evening routine, Miss Hartwell understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh observations, but tonight she was content to let her needles click in their familiar rhythm while reflecting on the enduring truth that in every village, beneath every perfectly maintained garden and every politely offered cup of tea, the grand drama of human nature continued to unfold, waiting only for the right moment to reveal its most shocking possibilities. The weeks that followed arranged themselves into the gentle sequence that had been so abruptly interrupted, each familiar routine laying a careful stitch over the raw place where violence had torn their community's fabric. Inspector Lennox's final visits carried the measured tone of administrative closure rather than urgent investigation, bringing news in carefully considered portions that allowed the village to digest each development without overwhelming their capacity for acceptance. Dr. Fleming, maintaining the courteous demeanor that had served him throughout his medical career, awaited trial at the county jail, while Mrs. Bly faced charges as an accessory with the understanding that her decades of faithful service might temper justice with mercy. Mrs. Ashford received the resolution of her legal difficulties with the composed dignity that had carried her through this ordeal. The London solicitors, working with discretion that acknowledged both historical irregularities and present realities, had arranged settlements that would preserve Rosemere House while addressing the legitimate claims that Mr. Vale's research had uncovered. The photographer's intentions, revealed through his carefully organized papers, proved to have been honorable rather than mercenary. His correspondence showed a man wrestling with the weight of historical truth, seeking to right old wrongs through legal channels rather than exploitation. His planned London journey intended to establish proper remedies for past injustices rather than personal profit. Timothy's vindication brought genuine relief to those who had supported him, though the young man's composure now carried the gravity of someone who had learned harsh lessons about the fragility of social standing and the dangerous power of buried secrets. His relationship with Daphne had been strengthened rather than strained by their shared experience of suspicion and ultimate exoneration, their wedding plans proceeding with quiet determination that spoke of people who had discovered the difference between romantic sentiment and genuine partnership. Miss Hartwell observed with satisfaction how adversity had revealed character rather than destroying it, proving once again that crisis often brought forth qualities that comfortable circumstances never tested. The village's adjustment to Dr. Fleming's betrayal followed patterns that Miss Hartwell recognized from previous upheavals as Meadowbrook slowly accommodated the uncomfortable truth that respectability could mask the most sophisticated deceptions. Dr. Hartwell from the neighboring parish had assumed the medical responsibilities with professional discretion that acknowledged the difficulty of replacing someone whose competence had never been questioned, only his judgment. The transition proceeded with minimal disruption to patient care, though certain residents would always remain uncomfortable with medical visits that reminded them how completely they had trusted someone capable of such calculated betrayal. Colonel Bradshaw's response revealed depths of character that his military bluster had previously concealed. His mortification at the theft of his Webley revolver gradually transformed into thoughtful consideration of how domestic security could be compromised by those with intimate knowledge of household routines. When he brought Miss Hartwell the worn leather watch strap he had insisted Dr. Fleming accept months earlier, his confession that kindnesses sometimes resembled orders carried the weight of genuine self-reflection. She accepted the strap quietly, noting how objects, like people, carried the memory of who had handled them, and the colonel departed with better posture than he had brought. The photographic equipment that had witnessed such tragedy was returned to Mr. Vale's estate with ceremonial care that acknowledged both its dark associations and its intrinsic value as instruments of artistic expression. The large format camera, its focusing cloth repaired and mechanism restored, would eventually serve another photographer, whose intentions were purely professional. Miss Hartwell reflected on the irony that tools designed to capture truth and beauty had been perverted into instruments of deception, yet would ultimately return to their proper purpose once removed from the corrupting influence of desperate circumstances. As autumn deepened and the investigation's immediate aftermath settled into memory, the village's social fabric showed signs of the resilience that had enabled rural communities to survive previous crises. New patterns of interaction emerged as residents learned to navigate relationships altered by their awareness of how completely they had been deceived. Yet Miss Hartwell observed that fundamental decency remained intact. The tragedy had not merely claimed a life, but had forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of professional authority and personal desperation. Walking through the quiet evening streets as November settled over Meadowbrook, Miss Hartwell reflected that Mr. Vale's last exposure had served its purpose despite the tragic circumstances of its creation. The photographer's death had revealed how noble impulses could be corrupted by misguided protectiveness, transforming medical knowledge into an instrument of death while maintaining the professional authority that made such sophisticated deception possible. Truth had ultimately emerged through patient observation and logical deduction, proving that human nature revealed itself in patterns as predictable as her knitting stitches, despite the most careful attempts at concealment. At the church hall, where the summer exhibition had grown into memory with corners already softened by time's passage, a small frame appeared near the place where Mr. Vale's camera had stood. It held a quiet photograph of St. Bartholomew's Tower in evening light, with a simple inscription, "Sebastian Vale, who loved to see." people pause there sometimes, not speaking over much, which was the English way of permitting feeling without the vulgarity of display. That evening, with the kettle singing and autumn light falling across her window-sill, Miss Hartwell took up her knitting. The pattern was one she had worked before, a modest chevron that repeated with satisfying regularity. Her needles moved almost without guidance, while her thoughts ran their familiar course. That knowledge was a tool rather than a virtue, that loyalty required braver honesty than secrecy demanded, that people in their attempts to shield one another from pain would sometimes walk into the very suffering they sought to prevent. The photographer's final exposure had drawn them all into focus, revealing not merely the murderer and those who loved him, but the bystanders who had learned what it meant to live with what could not be altered while changing what could be changed. The case was concluded in all the ways that mattered to officials, but for Meadowbrook it had become part of the ordinary education by which a place learns itself. In due time there would be another fete, another exhibition, another moment when courtesy and curiosity together would open a door that needed opening. As she settled into her evening routine, Miss Hartwell understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh observations, but tonight she was content to let her needles click in their familiar rhythm while reflecting on the enduring truth that in every village, beneath every perfectly maintained facade, the eternal drama of human nature continued to unfold in all its tragic complexity, waiting only for the right moment to reveal its most shocking possibilities to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand. The last of winter's frost had begun to retreat when Inspector Lennox made his final official call at Miss Hartwell's cottage, bringing with him the measured satisfaction of a case properly concluded and justice appropriately served. His acceptance of tea and the vicar's seed cake carried the unhurried quality of conversation rather than interrogation, and after the customary remarks about the promising signs of early spring, he posed the question that had lingered since Dr. Fleming's confession. How had she been so certain of his guilt when all evidence had seemed to point toward young Timothy? Miss Hartwell set down her cup with the deliberate care she brought to all her movements, her eyes holding the gentle amusement of someone who had been expecting precisely this inquiry. It was not certainty at first, she explained, but rather the accumulation of small inconsistencies that only human behavior could create. The camera's lens had been capped within moments of the tragedy, a reflex that spoke of long familiarity with photographic equipment rather than the panic one would expect from innocent bystanders. The tiny puncture in the bellows, with its characteristic singed edge, had been positioned exactly where a small explosive device might be concealed, while the focus mark at 3.5 feet belonged to intimate portraiture rather than group photography. Most tellingly, she continued, one photographic plate holder had been replaced with its dark slide oriented incorrectly, the sort of error that pressure might force even upon someone normally meticulous about such details. The missing 8th plate had been removed, not randomly, but specifically, suggesting someone who understood exactly what an accidental exposure might reveal. When that plate reappeared, hidden beneath Rosemare's settle, it had traveled along the only route that made sense for someone who routinely used the pantry entrance during professional visits. The medicinal scent that had lingered despite Mrs. Bly's thorough cleaning, the specialized hospital paper found near the garden wall, the precise timing required for the explosive device to detonate during the magnesium flash, all pointed toward someone with both medical knowledge and intimate access to the household's routines. Dr. Fleming's professional authority had provided perfect cover for movements that would have aroused suspicion from anyone else, while his genuine concern for Mrs. Ashford's welfare had supplied the emotional justification for actions that no rational person could defend. Inspector Lennox listened with the respectful attention of someone who recognized expertise when he encountered it, his questions revealing both professional admiration and personal curiosity about the methodical approach that had unraveled such sophisticated deception. Miss Hartwell's patient observation of human behavior under stress had provided insights that conventional investigation might have missed entirely, while her understanding of village relationships had illuminated the complex web of loyalties and obligations that had made desperate measures seem reasonable to otherwise honorable people. The legal proceedings that followed brought the sort of measured justice that acknowledged both guilt and the complex motivations that had driven it. Dr. Fleming, maintaining the dignified composure that had served him throughout his medical career, received a sentence that reflected the severity of his crime while recognizing the misguided nature of his protective instincts. Mrs. Bly's cooperation with the investigation earned her consideration for her decades of faithful service, though her retirement from Rosemere marked the end of an era of domestic loyalty that had ultimately been corrupted by circumstances beyond her control. Spring brought Timothy and Daphne's wedding at St. Bartholomew's, a quiet ceremony that felt less like public celebration than private recommitment to future possibilities. Their shared experience of suspicion and ultimate vindication had revealed the difference between romantic sentiment and genuine partnership, their quiet joy serving as visible proof that life possessed remarkable powers of renewal even after the most devastating betrayals. Miss Hartwell, observing from her customary pew, reflected on how the deepest human bonds were often forged not in comfort but in the crucible of shared adversity. Mrs. Ashford's legal difficulties found resolution through the sort of discreet arrangements that London solicitors employed when historical irregularities required modern remedies. The photographer's research, revealed through his carefully organized papers, had been motivated by scholarly integrity rather than mercenary intentions. His planned journey to London intended to establish proper remedies for past injustices through legal channels rather than personal exploitation. The settlements that preserved Rosemere House while addressing legitimate claims demonstrated that truth, however uncomfortable its immediate implications, could ultimately serve justice better than continued concealment. As summer returned to Meadowbrook and preparations began for another exhibition, the village had learned to accommodate uncomfortable knowledge, without allowing it to poison the ordinary kindnesses that made community life possible. The church hall bore no visible traces of the violence that had occurred there, yet Miss Hartwell noted how visitors unconsciously avoided the corner where Mr. Vale's camera had stood, as if the space itself retained some memory of that fatal demonstration. This subtle alteration in the room's geography spoke eloquently of how communities learned to live with their histories, accommodating difficult memories while refusing to be paralyzed by them. The photographic equipment that had witnessed such tragedy found new purpose in the hands of young Mr. Pemberton, whose artistic interests had been encouraged by his family's recognition that beauty and truth could coexist despite the temporary corruption of their instruments. Miss Hartwell watched with particular satisfaction as the large format camera, its focusing cloth repaired and mechanism restored, began to capture the ordinary miracles of village life with the same precision that had once documented darker purposes. On the anniversary of Mr. Vale's death, a small ceremony at his grave brought together those who had been touched by his brief presence in their community. The modest headstone bore the simple inscription he had requested in his will: "He sought to see truly." Miss Hartwell reflected that this epitaph captured both his noble intentions and the tragic consequences of his dedication to historical accuracy, while acknowledging that truth-seeking, however honorable its motivations, sometimes demanded prices that extended far beyond the seeker's individual sacrifice. As evening settled over the village and the familiar sounds of domestic routine resumed their gentle dominance, Miss Hartwell took up her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose understanding of human nature had been both confirmed and deepened by extraordinary circumstances. The pattern emerging beneath her needles was a complex interplay of stitches that would, when complete, reveal a delicate design requiring both patience and precision to execute properly. It was much like the investigation itself, she reflected, full of unexpected connections and hidden threads, moments when a single misplaced element could unravel everything, yet ultimately yielding to careful observation and systematic understanding. The photographer's last exposure had indeed captured more than anyone had anticipated, revealing not merely the mechanics of murder but the dangerous intersection of professional authority and personal desperation that could transform healing knowledge into an instrument of death. Yet the ultimate revelation had been more hopeful than tragic, demonstrating that truth possessed a resilience that could survive even the most sophisticated attempts at concealment. Human nature revealed itself in patterns as predictable as her knitting stitches, following established sequences that patient observation could decode despite the most careful attempts at deception. The village had learned that respectability could mask the most sophisticated deceptions, yet this awareness had refined rather than destroyed their capacity for trust, teaching them to distinguish between genuine authority and its counterfeit. As the church clock struck the hour and lamplight began to appear in cottage windows, Miss Hartwell reflected that Mr. Vale's legacy lay not in the tragic circumstances of his death, but in the community's gradual recognition that truth, however uncomfortable its immediate implications, remained preferable to the sort of protective deceptions that ultimately destroyed what they sought to preserve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh observations, but tonight she was content to let her needles click in their familiar rhythm while contemplating the enduring mystery of human nature, which continued to reveal itself in all its tragic complexity and persistent hope to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand. The photographer's final exposure had served its purpose despite the devastating circumstances of its creation, proving once again that in every village, beneath every carefully maintained facade, the eternal drama of human nature continued to unfold, waiting only for the right moment and the proper observer to reveal its most profound truths about the intricate patterns that connected them all.